Good afternoon and welcome to the Eton Bridge and NEDA webinar. Thank you all very much for joining this afternoon. This is the 5th lunchtime webinar session we've had in 2021, and it's a pleasure that all of you can join us on this particularly sunny afternoon. I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon by Louis Cooper, CEO of NEDA, and Jim Dewar, who is a proven CFO in his past career and currently Chair of Audit Committee at Lamprell PLC and also Chair of Audit Committee at Chiron. In a second, we're going to be discussing about businesses pivoting and how agile do you have to be in the boardroom. Firstly, what I'd like to do is just to give you a quick market update and insight from our view from what we're seeing in the market at Eton Bridge. As a lot of you will know, Eton Bridge are an interim and search firm operating in the SME mid-market, both in the domestic environment and significantly more internationally. And what we've seen this year is very much a steady uptick in appointments. We've seen some increases around from an interim perspective across all functions, and from a search perspective, particularly C-suite and C-1 hires. The international element of our offering to the market very much has become a firm staple in Eton Bridge's core revenue. We've seen now, and what we've got running are a number of mandates from Vietnam to Singapore to India to the UAE and in US and in Mexico. So we are beginning to see activity where regional teams are growing out their boardrooms, where boardrooms are changing internationally and requiring to pivot and bring in different types of expertise. Moving ahead, what we see going forward into the mid part of 2021 and through to the latter part of 2021 is a real change and thinking around boardroom structures, programs and investment into both systems integrations, new systems, and growing and businesses pivoting into new markets and new sectors. It's been an absolute pleasure supporting clients over the past year, and we continue to support our existing clients very heavily, and through our very strong referral network and interim network, we're beginning to support new clients. So thank you all for your support, and it's been absolutely fantastic working with you. So this afternoon, as I mentioned, it's a great pleasure to be working and discussing with Jim and Louis. I'd like to now invite them onto the screen to start off our discussion around when a business has to pivot, and a lot of businesses have really had to pivot in 2020. How agile is the boardroom? Good afternoon, Louis. Good afternoon. Thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Hi, Louise.
Hi, Louise.
Thank you. So I think, Jim, if we may start with you, please. As Chair of Audit Committee from Chiron and from a Lamprell perspective, 12 months ago, practically almost to the day, the world was launched into a global pandemic and lockdown. I know that you've been, particularly with Lamprell, an integral part of supporting them in their strategic development. It'd be great to hear about your journey and your insights from a board perspective, how the Lamprell board and the boards that you've been involved in have been able to pivot very successfully in that very uncertain market.
Yes, thank you. The combined whammy of COVID-19, the resultant collapse in oil prices in 2020, plus the increasing focus on what's described as energy transition, has had a huge impact on the board focus over the last year, and has created what we've recently described as Lamprell Reimagined. COVID-19 in particular, we first saw the implications from a board perspective last March when the FRC wrote to Chairman CEOs, audit committees, and CFOs of public companies who were planning to come out reporting their 2019 results in sort of the end of March 2020. And Lamprell was getting ready to go. I had actually flown to Ireland for a board meeting in March when we got the letter in from the FRC saying, we encourage you strongly to take the time to carefully assess the impact of COVID-19 on your business, and in particular on your ability to sign off on the going concern, which, as I'm sure many of you will know, are 15 months look ahead from the time of the issue of the financial statements. But in addition, there was an encouragement to think about the viability statement, which is another sign off within the financial statements of public companies that the directors confirm they've looked 3 years ahead from the date of the end of the year. So in our case, 3 years from 1st of January 2020. So in order for us to properly do that, the board and the audit committee got into a significant review of cash flows in a level of detail that we'd never felt was necessary before. So we were looking at monthly cash flows. We were looking at downside scenario cases. There was one case where we had no new wins of contracts in 2020 and 2021 because we could see it being that impactful on our business. And so I think one of the biggest differences for me in the agility of the board is the need to recognize in these circumstances the importance of the cash flows and the ability of the company to continue trading.
Thank you, Jim. I think that initially was an immediate reaction, across the globe. And Louis, I'd be keen just to get your insight, obviously from a NEDA perspective, with your focus on the training and development and the support of non-execs in their journey and the support of them transitioning from ED to NED, but also in terms of operating successfully as a non-exec. Did you see an uptick in inquiries from a training and a development and an insight perspective from particular governance areas?
I think we saw quite a bit of activity in terms of people sense checking their skills and knowledge and ability to deal with the changes that Jim sort of outlined. I think we found with the pandemic sort of kicking in, people very quickly sort of looked at their business models and tried to understand the impact that they were having to deal with. And I think the risk side in particular is an area which I think quite often had sort of slipped down the agenda of boards and wasn't always picked up in terms of the level of detailed review. And I think what we've seen is a lot more attention in terms of understanding the profile of the risks that organisations now face, particularly supply chains and the extended enterprise that people are now operating in. And I think particularly if you've got an international perspective, it really threw up the requirement to understand where the sensitivities lie and whether you needed to refocus attention on sort of local aspects as much as anything else. And I think there was a very quick assessment of the people side as well, in terms of how we make sure that we protect our people. We deal with health and safety issues, obviously, as being central to that, but also helping people to deal with some of the sort of social aspects that they personally had to deal with. So there was more empathy and more focus of attention on how people were managing to deal with the situation that was unfolding. I think the strong message from our perspective was the adaptability of boards to actually deal with these situations, and particularly working very quickly with a range of things being thrown at them. They were able to make sure that they put their attention around the right things. And as Jim has said, a lot of this has been getting back to basics in terms of understanding the financial dynamics that are unfolding, and making sure that at board level you've got the skills and the capabilities to actually make sure that you're focused on the right things and dealing with things in the appropriate sequence of events to make sure that you're up to speed and making sure that you're actually able to make decisions quickly and to follow those through and make sure that each area that is relevant to the business surviving in some cases has been taken into consideration.
Thank you. And certainly we see from our lens looking through search and recruitment providers to businesses looking to pivot in the market and pivoting to where and to how and what is the strategic analysis behind that. And Jim, I'd be keen to you touched on it briefly in your opening comments, but I'd be very keen just to hear about that journey that you took with the Lamprell board in terms of that pivoting and that strategic decision making as to pivot to where and how are you going to do it and who with?
Okay, traditionally Lamprell has been a rig fabrication business, rig refurbishment business, but over the last 3 years or so since I've been on the board, we have been slowly moving to pick up more renewables businesses. We're now on our third contract, and we've to date since 2017 we've fabricated over 100 foundations for the UK flagships offshore wind farms. And if we look ahead to our future bid pipeline, some 40% or $2.5 billion of that bid pipeline is linked to renewables projects. So we have, gradually been moving towards a different future, and that, of course, is all consistent with what's happening in the industry in energy transition. But some of you may have already seen it, but in January of this year, we announced a strategic reorganization into 3 business units: renewables, digital, and oil and gas. And the focus of that then is to create the opportunity to get greater alignment with customers, and also to a significant change in how we will manage the business going forward. And of course, that then leads you into thinking about the composition of the board, the skill sets on the board, the management teams across the different businesses. And so that has been a significant and dramatic pivot change, if you will. And we've been working this for, like I said, a number of years. We also announced our digital focus, and that's the culmination of about 2 years of work, partly with Boston Consulting Unit. They have a digital consultancy practice based out in the US, and we sent a number of our brightest and best over to the States to work with Boston Consulting, and then come back with very clear ideas about opportunities for the future. And when we started out on the digital journey, it was more around a focus on cost savings and efficiencies. So things like, could you have robotic welders in the yards, eye recognition technology to allow people to get into the yards every day much quicker. I mean, we have over 5,000 people working for us, and a lot of these people are in the yards, and so you want to be as efficient. But we've kind of moved from efficiencies on costs to future revenue streams and opportunities to create new sources of income for the company. And I don't know if anyone has seen it, but we made an announcement this morning, which we've been working on for some time, where there's a strategic alliance between Injasat from the UAE and Lamprell to work on digital transformation projects together, and that's going to be very exciting in support of the digital business created within the. I mean, I think COVID has hit so many organizations globally in such a hard way. I would argue in Lamprell's case, it's been even more so, because a very large proportion of the workers are in yards. They can't work from home. They can't self-isolate. They have to be working together. And last year we had a period of time where we had a significant number of workers in self-isolation, because as a result of a visit to the yards, we subsequently found out some of the visitors had COVID, and we had to do a track and trace, and that put a whole bunch of people in self-isolation for nearly 2 weeks. And so that means you take on more accommodation, because we provide accommodation for a large proportion of our workers. Transportation was affected because we had to have more buses to move people back and forward to the yards from their accommodation. And then, we took the decision as a board in late December that we were going to progress with full vaccination offered to all of our staff. And so we've gone out and procured the vaccines, and a large proportion of the staff now have had the first vaccine. It's over 90%, and we're working now through to get the rest of the workforce their second vaccination. So 2020 was, a huge reimagining of the business into our future, but at the same time dealing with COVID. And Louis made a very, very good point about risk analysis. In 2019, we introduced a process of risk deep dives for the audit committee. So the audit committee met with the risk owners, and we did a series of those in 2019, and we did a number more in 2020. And they were things exactly as Louis said around counterparty risk. And typically you think of counterparty risks as being customers, perhaps having financial problems. But we saw that one of our biggest risks was suppliers not being able to fulfill their obligations to us. So we've been doing a lot of risk analysis of potential suppliers throughout 2020 as well. So I don't remember, in all my years as being a board member and audit committee chair, I don't remember a change of focus and a need for the board to be agile as we were last year, and it continues, because we're certainly not through this from a board perspective. And of course, the FRC has again requested that companies take the time to understand the COVID implications. So we have already gone out to the market in Lamprell's case and said that we will be reporting our results not at the end of March, as we would normally do, but either in late April or early May, depending on when we feel, together with the auditors, that we're ready. And we've gone through the first round of all the cash flows again, updated for the latest views on the market and business, and our latest financial position. And we will do that again, sometime in April, to understand again our ability to sign off for the going concern and the viability statement.
Thank you. And I'm keen to, whilst reflecting on the creation of Lamprell Reimagined and also the rigor and the detail required to have that risk analysis on such a regular basis. I think the balance within the boardroom, when you've got exec members and non-exec members being able to put their analytical hats on, but also have that creative thinking and diversity of thought. I'd be keen just to explore that a little with you both in terms of perhaps first Louis, around diversity of thought and a degree diversity of expertise and backgrounds. It'd be great to get your insights from a NEDA perspective in the development of boardrooms, from how are they thinking about making appointments in line with the D&I agenda.
I think obviously it's gained a lot of momentum recently. I think from our perspective, the key player in all of this is the chair of the board, because they are sort of the gatekeeper of who comes onto the board, and they sort of build the board. And I think in the past, our concern was that a number of chairs were sort of building the board in their own likeness and getting very much this sort of groupthink perspective coming through, rather than, as you say, Louise, getting more of the diversity and inclusion sort of aspect coming through. And I think there's obviously been a lot more pressure in terms of reporting and media comment and focus of attention on how do we make sure we get that that focus of attention. And I think that the other thing that's been lacking to date has been succession planning, in terms of having a formal process to actually make sure we have got people coming through, and we've got a process, a nominations process that actually works. And I think that's where there have been some step changes in terms of people actually stepping back and saying, okay, what does an effective board look like? And how do we make sure that we've got the right team players? And one thing that we've seen just over this last 6 months is a focus of attention on board effectiveness and board performance. And we've got 3 boards we're working with at the moment, just exploring that in terms of undertaking a review with them. And I think they've really felt that it's a good time just to sense check how good we are and any areas that we need to improve and develop. And we see this as quite important in terms of just making sure that this diversity of thoughts, Louise, as you said, is demonstrated and coming through. And I think the NED role in particular, obviously, has an element of technical aspect to it, but there's also the softer skills that you need to sort of bring in terms of understanding how to operate at board level, the ability to ask the right questions and challenge appropriately as well, and then to be backed up with the appropriate sort of knowledge base that you've got behind you around, governance, risk, finance, strategy, people. These are the sort of the key elements that you need to demonstrate. And I think picking up on Jim's point, I think it's excellent to hear that you've been very proactive in getting people to understand the digital aspect, because that's central, I think, to most organisations, and it still tends to be underplayed at board level in terms of a real lack of skills around the digital piece, and making sure that we've got people who understand that area. Well, the question we've been asking consistently is, do we need the digital NED, or do we need the digital board, so that everybody is sort of joined up on understanding the strategy and the way that we need to be more strategic in these areas. So I think it's quite a lot of push for this diversity piece to actually gain even more momentum. And I think whilst in the UK we're very geared up to reporting this information, it's really how do we change behaviours and how do we make sure that we have a true diversity aspect playing out at boardroom level.
Thank you. And I completely agree from a diversity piece in terms of that breadth of thinking and breadth of expertise. And Jim, you've had a truly global career and lived and worked in a variety of different countries, having sat on different boards with that cultural diversity, and that's one obviously a clear element of diversity. Where do you think boards should be if you were to cast our mind forwards 5 to 10 years? What should it look like? And I think encompassing that question around digital, I really like the idea of, is it a digital board or is it a digital NED? Now, I have a view, but it'd be great to hear yours.
Yeah, when I think of diversity, I do think of it in the broadest sense. And whilst I absolutely, anyone who knows me will say that I've always supported equality in appointments, irrespective of gender or background or anything else. I still think we're lagging behind. I'm pleased to say that on my current 2 boards and the board that I was on as interim chairman up until the end of 2019, we've had on each of these boards very high quality women contributing at the highest level. I think though we can do a lot more in terms of more women on boards and more diversity, as I say, in the broadest sense, to get that thinking round the table that really does bring something different. I was horrified last year when I was approached by one of the headhunters, not Eton, asking me to consider a board position, an audit committee chair, and they sent me the job spec. When I looked at the job spec, all I saw was another 6 non-executive directors just like me. Many were my age, many had grown up in Scotland, many had worked for BP, and it was just shocking. And I turned it down and I had a conversation at the very top of that search firm, encourage them to think differently. So I think there's a lot that the search firms can do, but I also agree with you. I think the chairman is really important, as is the chair of the nominations committee. Having them thinking in a much more diverse way, I think is essential, because I think there's a lot more we can genuinely do and should do.
I think there's also the age element as well. I think we feel is a big differential, because I think, as Jim said, it's quite often you look at a board in terms of looking at the financial accounts, and you see the pictures of all the board members, and they do all look fairly the same beast, and the same age and the same background. I think one thing we feel that could make a real change is bringing younger people into the framework. That's not obviously lowering the standards in terms of the people coming on board, but we've been working on NED development programs where we've been working with organisations to work with their talent program and bring people who have demonstrated that they're going to continue within that organisation, but to give them the breadth of experience outside of the organisation as a NED or a trustee can actually help them as an individual and help them to grow as an individual, because they're getting boardroom experience, they're getting insight into strategy and governance and other aspects in another organisation. But they can bring that back into...
I think that's right. And I think digital in particular offers the opportunity to some people who are much younger.
And what we've it's interesting, I've had a couple of stories that I can't attribute to a particular company, but there's 2 organizations within the FTSE 100 that have got a program where they are having new individuals in an earlier stage of their career appointed to the board, and it's they've run through a formal process, and there were 2 slots. And the individuals are now safely on the board. And what they found after a year in place is that whilst the individuals that are sort of at the mid-management level, sort of earlier stage of their career, have come in and they've added real digital insight into that boardroom. the benefit from the board has been that they've had these individuals at a different stage of their career, so different age dynamic, being able to be there, to be able to ask questions, give insight from their generational perspective. And also the board members have been very proactive in supporting the development and supporting them in their understanding so that they can contribute appropriately. So the exercise and the programme has actually worked, and both sides have had felt real benefit from both the personal perspective and also a boardroom perspective. So it'd be very interesting to see when I think there is going to be a report written on it when that's published. It'd be great just to see the impact and results of that going forward. And I think, you know, moving up on the thread of, if I go on to ESG, and obviously we've touched on the S around social and D&I, I would be really interested, Jim, firstly, just to hear about the impact of ESG and the governance piece around your decision making in the board when you've got COVID to cope with, you've got a pivoting business, and you've got to also encompass, and now it's mandatory, ESG requirements.
Yes, indeed. And we have established within Lamprella a committee, a subcommittee, to work with the, we've put the whole ESG reporting under the Nominations and Governance Committee. We feel that's the most natural home. So the chair of that is working very closely with this ESG subcommittee within the company, and the objective for this year is to be very clear about what our targets are going forward for reporting against from next year onwards. So from the end of 2021, we will be reporting in our annual report on this matter. So this year is about establishing the benchmarks, working with other companies to kind of figure out what's best practice, and then get ready to introduce that not only into the annual report, but also into the reward structures for the executive management team. You know, either through the STIPs or the LTIPs. That's where we're headed on it. But I'd like to pick on the issue of governance, and also the point Louis made about risks. One of the things that we identified last March when we started to really put people in the offices from working from home was the increased potential risk of fraud or a breakdown in internal controls, because people were no longer coming into the office. The normal checks and balances kind of weren't necessarily there. And what we also wanted to do with that was have the ownership with the members of the executive committee. No, this wasn't an internal audit issue. This was about ownership by the head of procurement and the CFO, etc. So what we did was, instead of internal audit doing their approved audit program for the year, we scrapped that and instead replaced it by the head of internal audit working with each of the ExCo members to identify the biggest risks that they saw from people working from home. It was under the headline of what keeps you awake at night. And we referred to the ExCo members as the internal control and risk partners to the head of internal audit, and they did reports together, which came then to the audit committee to review during the year. And that was very successful in identifying the areas where we felt there could be a governance issue, there could be a risk, whether it was in financial reporting, IT controls, supply chain function, warehousing, workforce disruption, etc. And I think that was another example of the audit committee and the board being agile to say, hang on, this is not business as usual. We have to stand back from it and think about where we could be exposed and how we're going to mitigate any increased risks.
That seems to, Jim, that seems to tie into some work that we've been doing with some organisations recently around assurance mapping, of understanding where your risks are across the organisation and who is best placed to give you assurance and give you feedback against those risks, and making sure we focus attention on understanding the risk better and making sure that the assurance provider is the best provider, and we'll get to grips with actually how to deal with that. So it sounds as if you've taken that sort of perspective in terms of, really focusing on, what is that risk telling us and who are the best people to actually deal with it. And as you say, to scrap the internal audit plan and deal with something that's live is probably a good, approach to take to, as you say, to pivot and focus attention on something that is something that is a real sort of current risk that we need to deal with. And I think so many internal auditors, and I've been an internal auditor myself for a number of years, get wedded to their plan and don't actually do a pure risk-based view. They talk about being risk-based, but they don't always approach it in that way. And I think it sounds as if you had a really good experience in terms of turning that around to something that's going to make a big difference to make sure you focus on that area with the best eyes and ears and understand how it actually works for you.
Yes, and I mean, we're going back this year. Once we, people come back into the office, I think we'll go back more to the more traditional audit plan. But I do observe that I think there's a closer relationship between the audit function and the other parts of the business. I made it very clear, you're not being audited, you're working this together, and that worked well. The other big area that I think we've taken the opportunity over the last few months to look at is the effectiveness of the audit committee. I mean, as everyone on this call knows, there is increasing focus on audit committees and boards every year to take on greater responsibility and transparency, which I support. Deloitte Academy, I'll give them a little plug if I may. They developed an audit effectiveness checklist recently, and it has, as I recall, 227 questions for the chair and the members of the audit committee to consider, and you can rank yourself. 1, which means you've got work to do. 2, you kind of meet expectations, and 3, you exceed expectations. And each member of the audit committee and the CFO and the company secretary, we all evaluated that and came up with an assessment that basically we should have scored 454. We ended up scoring 456 from our combined view of world, and I was very pleased with that, because I felt that and if for anyone who's on the call who hasn't seen that, it's a very, very good tool if you are an audit committee member, an audit committee chair, or you're thinking of going down that path. That's a very good guide and tool. And I think our overall score, although I was very pleased with it, it did demonstrate once again that we are at the beginning of the journey on ESG, and that is an area, like I said previously, over the next year we will be focusing on understanding our ESG targets and then getting ready to report on them on an annual basis.
Thank you. Whilst during our discussion, we've had some great questions coming in. Thank you very much for sending the questions in. Particularly interesting one I've got from one listener. Does pivot really just mean that your strategy has failed completely? Jim.
I don't think, in our case in Lamprell, I don't think our strategy failed. I think it was evolving over time. I mean, the move of all of the oil and gas companies to a different future has gained huge momentum in the last kind of year, in particular 18 months. And I think Lamprell had recognized that previously with the move into renewables. I mean, I said that renewables accounts for 40% of our bid pipeline, which is 2.5 billion. The other 60% or 3.5 billion is still in oil and gas. So I think it's, for us, it's an and conversation. It's not a failure. And I think the digital on top, and it comes back to the point of, we spent a lot of time in 2019 and in early 2020 having the CIO of the business in the boardroom with us. And that individual was, comparison to the board, very young. And that individual, over a series of probably 5 or 6 board sessions on digital, fundamentally convinced us of the need to move in this direction. And I'd encourage anyone who's got any interest to have a look on the Lamprell website today, because you can see the announcement we made of the joint venture and our commitment together to spend $7 million in this $7 million in 2021 developing the digital expertise. And I think what that says to me is we will be looking, as we go out and think about the future, the digital expertise on the board and in the management teams is going to be fundamental, as is renewables.
I think also the strategy shouldn't be standing still. I think in the past, too often people were wedded to a 5-year strategy or an extended period to review things. And I think we've moved now into a period where we're looking at being more receptive to what's going on. So the strategy needs to be flexed and reviewed on a more continuous basis, and probably becomes more tactical in that sense, in being more of emergent strategy that you're trying to keep up with, because things are just changing so quickly. And I think, we've been going through different phases of activity as well, in terms of thinking about being resilient and recovering from the current situation. And that may lead to restructuring. It may need to be focused on different employee engagement, maybe thinking about the morale of the organisation, that sort of thing. And then how do we reorientate to make sure that we move things forward? And that can be a change to some of the expectations in terms of our behaviours and how we operate. It could be segueing into being more of a good corporate citizen, so picking up, Louise, as you said, in terms of ESG matters. It could be new ways of working. Obviously, that's going to be evolving, I think, over the coming months in terms of how we sort of come out of this situation. But it's really trying to track some of these different phases of development and activity that are relevant to how we as an organisation need to be receptive to what's going on. And I don't think you can just keep your head in the sand and say, we're just going to follow our sort of normal strategy. It needs to evolve, and and that's where the board in particular needs to actually think these things through and use the NEDs experience to actually understand what the sensitivities are, and to use that experience to actually try and test other ways of working as well.
I think what we're seeing from our boardroom discussions is that I suppose the digital journey and that it used to be called digital transformation, but I don't think, Louis, as you quite rightly say, it is an ongoing development. It is a piece that is here to stay, and it is an ongoing journey that we're on from a digital perspective. But the transformation piece and looking at global transformation, that was certainly, we saw from a board perspective in 2020 that was paused, where organisations were or starting an ERP program, whether it's by country, whether it's by region. There was certainly a pause in activity from a global transformation perspective. What we're seeing now is, in order to restart that, it's needing board sponsorship, it's needing revisiting board sponsorship, and then pushing down into the regions again. So it's almost restarting the program and resetting the program going forward. And I think that's quite interesting, because they're not afraid to go, actually, we need to reset and actually go left, not right now. And I think from leading the business out of 2020, and we are now consistently being asked for very strong leaders to take businesses out of the global pandemic and onto the next phase. What does that look like in a personality and a profile? And it'd be great just to hear about that. What insights have you seen, and what would you say in terms of that leadership out of a pandemic? What does good look like from your perspective? Could I ask you that first, please?
Sorry?
Could I ask Louis, in terms of leadership out of a pandemic, what are the sort of insights that you would say, appropriate a good leader coming out of a pandemic?
I think they need to have clear vision, and need to make sure they've got the right sort of people around them to deliver the way forward. And I think they need to be, strong characters, because they're going to need to make some difficult decisions which relate to people in particular. And I think what we found with the pandemic is that there could be quite a big change in terms of the utilization of technology being speeded up, which will then have an impact on the number of people that we need, where we need to work, and these types of issues. So I think you need people who are not going to be afraid to make these decisions, and to make sure that they've got counsel around them that will help them to frame that, and to make sure that the communication process is clear, and that people can see that it makes sense in terms of how this is unfolding. And I think it's very much thinking about the dynamism of change, whilst also having stability of sort of key people that are going to help you through this process. And it's probably also understanding your stakeholder expectations as well, so that you become very stakeholder centric, which is, I think, what has been the order of the day more recently with Section 172 requirements, focusing on the success of the company. We're thinking more broadly about our stakeholders and how we interact with them, and make sure that we're focused on their needs and their requirements going forward. So I think there's quite a range of different things that the leader is having to deal with. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how many people remain in post, and how many people feel that they're not the person to take the organisation to the next level. So it's probably going to be another board effectiveness perspective in terms of have we got the right team to take us forward. So I think that's going to be interesting just to see how that plays out. So it'll probably be coming back to you, Louise, in terms of how these people need to be the right people, and making sure that we've got the right leaders in place in particular.
Great, thank you, Louise.
Yeah, I would agree with virtually everything Louise said. I think I might add a couple. One, I think, is a ruthlessness to get the cost structure under control. What last year said to the board and the CEO and the CFO was, if revenues are not going to be guaranteed to come through because of COVID and the impact on the industry and the energy transition, then we need to cut costs, and we need to do that in a very deep but thoughtful way, and we did. But that was painful, and there were some very tough decisions. We had to let some very, very good people go, And so I agree with that. I think empathy as well. I mean, what I saw in Lamprell from the top management there was a real desire to treat people with dignity and respect as they were leaving the organisation, and I know that was very much appreciated. And then I think, you know, communicate. You know, the CEO has done a great job with the executive committee, getting messages out there consistently to staff, to customers, to suppliers, and I think that really matters.
Thank you. That's super. Look, it's been a great discussion, and prior to wrapping up, I'd be keen just to hand over to Louis, just to give a 5-minute update on NEDA and the latest thinking from that side, and then I'll circle back in 5 minutes. Thank you, Louis.
Thanks, Louise. Yes, I think NEDA is very focused on supporting NEDs through their sort of career life cycle, and we're very much engaged in training, educating, advising, helping people with knowledge and information to undertake the role of a non-executive director. And some of the areas of focus at the moment is how do we continue to widen the pool and make sure we've got the right people coming into the role. And we've seen, as I said right at the beginning, quite an uptick in terms of training and education and people wanting to learn more. I was all morning on a session and came straight onto this webinar, talking to people about sort of being a NED, and the diversity piece is also important to us in terms of making sure we get the right people who can come with innovation, can come with different ways of thinking through the situations that are presented to them, and an understanding of how they're going to make a difference and bring value to the organisation. So we feel that it's very much knowing the role and also understanding the professionalism in undertaking the NED role. So our NED certificate programme, which we kicked off a few years ago, we've had over the last 18 months over 100 candidates going through the programme, split between both an e-based and classroom sort of learning platforms. And we're now developing new courses around being a chair. We've also just recently rolled out finance for non-finance directors, because we feel that, you know, with the diversity piece in particular, if we're trying to attract people who've got a technology background, a people background, sales background, they don't always have the sort of the financial piece. And we feel there that it's just understanding the accounts and understanding information. It's not becoming an accountant or understanding double entry bookkeeping, but just giving people that confidence to deal with that sort of situation. And the other area that we're looking at quite closely at the moment is the committees. And Jim, I think, articulated it very well in terms of the audit committee, you know, being sort of central to a lot of the areas around sort of finance and reporting. And I see that with the BEIS consultation around restoring trust in audit and corporate governance that came out just a week or two ago, you know, there's going to be a more focus of attention on the role of the audit committee. And we had a session again 2 weeks ago around REMCOs, and we had 200 people sign up for a training session, which was an all-morning session. That was the highest number we've ever had to sign up for a training session. But they wanted to get up to date with latest developments, trends, and that sort of thing. So we see that committee again as a prime committee for keeping up to date. And the third element is the nominations committee. We talked about succession planning and the people side, and I think the nominations committee has been the Cinderella committee for so long. And I think more attention needs to be given to that committee, particularly around, you know, making sure we affect some of these changes that we're talking about. And we've got people who are going to actually achieve that and do that. And the final piece that we're working on is our NED handbook, which again, we're going to publish our 6th edition later this year, because we feel that you know, we need to make sure there's a focus of attention on some of these new areas that we've been talking about today, and just keeping people up to date with some of the changes that are going through. And ESG we see is very important as well. We slightly touched on that earlier on. And we see that the risk side, in terms of threats and opportunities around ESG, again, are areas that need further attention. And we've talked about sort of the threats around risk. I think the biggest turning point is going to be the opportunity side generally. How do we make sure that people focus on the positive aspects? And we ran a survey with NEDs on corporate reputation a few months ago on the back of COVID-19. And we were very pleased to hear from, I think 80% of the NEDs who replied were very positive about what's going to come out of the COVID situation in particular. And they were very positive in terms of grasping some of the opportunities, which they see are the sort of the next step in terms of making sure we're taking on board what we've learned, but spinning it more into the positive aspects that we need to build upon, rather than continually thinking about sort of the negative sort of threats and the negative connotations that come through from risk in particular. So I've probably slightly gone over my 5 minutes, but
that's great. Thank you.
Areas that we're looking to develop.
No, that's super. Thank you very much, Louis. And Jim, thank you very much indeed this afternoon for your insights. And we've got great learnings. I mean, we've covered a huge range of topics anchored around pivoting boards, looking at diversity, inclusion, ESG, and also skill set and succession planning. And perhaps, we could spend, well, I could spend hours on succession planning. but look, thank you both very much for joining me this afternoon for this discussion. At the close of the webinar, there will be a form to fill in for your feedback. Please do send any questions. We'll endeavour to respond to you directly. We will also be publishing a summary of the discussion this afternoon, and that'll be sent directly to you. The next webinar, I think, is going to be in May. We're having a short break over April, but it'd be a pleasure to have you there. Thank you very much all for joining us this afternoon, and enjoy a sunny March afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.